Greetings and welcome to the Department of Tangents podcast, a conversation with Nathan Ballingrud, author of Wounds, 6 Stories from the Border of Hell, with new music from Bernard Fowler. I'm your host, Nick Zano. Nathan Ballingrud has a wonderfully demented imagination. He has a way of reaching into your brain and finding all those little creepy corners where you hide the things that make you cringe and make your skin crawl. In his first collection of stories, North American Lake Monsters, there was a bit more realism in his stories and characters. Hulu has optioned that and will start shooting an anthology series this summer or fall. In Wounds, he goes for broke, to the point where he said he was worried he might be going over the top. Not worried enough, though, to pull anything back. In Atlas of Hell, a decapitated skull allows a mob lackey to fetch demons and objects from the underworld. In The Diabolist, a young girl is left alone in her scientist father's mansion when he dies with an imp trapped in a tank and starts to fight back against the town that has always ostracized her. In Skull Pocket, flesh-eating ghouls sponsor a deadly fair for children. In The Visible Filth, which is now a film called Wounds on the festival circuit starring Armie Hammer, Dakota Johnson, and Zazie Beetz, a bartender in a New Orleans dive fights his own jealousy and a mysterious stranger who contacts him through a phone left behind at the bar after a fight. Nightmare creatures attack a town and flay its inhabitants to make giant singing skin structures in the maw, and pirates take, quite literally, a journey to the shores of hell in the butcher's table. I talked to Ballingrud about his inspiration for these stories, which included Stephen King and Mike Mignola, how they're all connected, or at least 2 of them are very connected, the new film, and more. He finds all of this creepiness quite fun, which is good for us because he's got more stories on the way and a full-length book he's working on to release in 2021, which he says is set on Mars in 1930. Stick around after the conversation for new music from longtime Rolling Stones backup singer Bernard Fowler, who is next week's podcast guest. And now, Nathan Ballingrud. I want to start with a list of terrifying images from the book, and you can tell me if I have these right. This is just a short list of things you can find in Wounds: ghouls that eat corpses, the thigh bone of a gangster's murdered son that is slowly and painfully morphing back into a person. Do I have that characterization correct? Yep.
It may or may not be a person. It's morphing into something tree-like.
Yes, but it's alive and seems to be in pain, or maybe I'm reading that into it.
No, that's true. That's correct.
There's also a demon's conscience in a holding tank who speaks through an old radio strapped to the tank's side.
Yeah.
Walls of human skin with heads still attached and their mouths open, and they sing. And and something called carrion angels that occupy a host's body and maim them from the inside out.
Yeah, they don't have to occupy a host's body, but that is a thing they do in the story.
Yes, and there are also other angels who might be connected to those in a different story who have to be born through a host and destroy their host in that process.
Yes.
Are those? So my main question is, how terrifying is it for you to be alone with your thoughts?
Not at all. Those are all like fun things. You know, I grew up just loving the horror genre, and to me, those are all like, you know, some of that stuff was just kind of like so over the top that I was afraid that it would be too carnival-like, if that makes any sense. I think more fun than scary. To me, it's not scary. To me, that's fun to think about.
And you were running this stuff by your family, right? Before you put this out to make sure this wasn't over the top?
No. My family doesn't really read much of anything until it's published.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, except for a few exceptions. I don't really have beta readers.
I remember in the acknowledgments you had mentioned somebody who you were running this by. I forget who it was.
Sometimes I'll talk over ideas with my daughter. Like if I'm stuck, she's a good sounding board. And so she doesn't. I don't really run the by for impressions or approval or anything. But if I'm just kind of kicking around some ideas. I'll get them over to her and see if she has any insight.
There's so many wonderful and disturbing things in this book. Was there anything that was over the top that you toned down or pulled back on?
Nope. No, it all went in there.
Uh-huh. So, and it's also, I would say, very literary. Where do you get your taste for literary fiction? Is that a separate influence from horror, or do you have some influences that sort of mix the two?
I think it started out as being separate, but they've melded a whole lot more since then. In the beginning, my literary interests were very much like in a realist mode. Hemingway was a big one. Carver was a big one. Richard Ford. But right now, it's just there's so many literary. That's a charged word, but
yeah.
But there's so much literary work in the genre, and it's not difficult to find it. And I think that the barrier in the reader's minds between those modes is a whole lot more permeable now than I thought it was, 20, 30 years ago.
I was thinking as I was reading this is the type of writing I would hold up to someone who disparages or dismisses horror as a literary genre. Is that something you think about being a good example of the genre?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think the separation between literary fiction and genre fiction is artificial. I think there has always been very literary genre fiction and very and fiction described as literary, which is really anything but. So yeah, I'm happy to hear that, and I definitely strive to. Well, I think the best way to put it is I was reading an interview with Salman Rushdie many years ago, and one of the things he said in there stuck with me, and he said he writes fiction that aspires to the condition of literature. It's like you don't always get there, but you try. That's kind of how I feel about it too. I aspire to the condition.
I wasn't thinking of Carver, but thinking back on The Visible Filth now, that seems very much influenced by Carver.
Probably subconsciously. He wasn't much in my mind by the time I was reading The Visible Filth, but he was more so when I was writing the stories in North American Lake Monsters. So yeah, I think like most of us, influences are constant. I'm constantly influenced by new things, and profound influences from when I was younger stay with me, even if I'm no longer like consciously thinking about them.
Well, there are some very, in my mind, poetic passages in here. If you look at the Diabolist, is that the way you pronounce it? Diabolist, or where's the accent on that?
I've seen it. I pronounce it personally Diabolist. Most things I've seen online seem to indicate that it's Diabolist. That just sounds wrong to me. So if I'm wrong, I'll continue to be wrong.
But there's a passage in which you're describing a demon's thoughts. It's a demon that's been trapped in a cage or in a tank by a scientist who was trying to bring his wife back from hell. And you never really address why he's so certain his wife was in hell to bring her back. But that's a separate issue. But the scientist commits suicide at one point, and this is how the demon reacts in the tank. He says, "I knew something had happened to him, though I had no word for death. In the middle of the night I was engulfed by a falling tide of his dreams, thoughts, and memories, which came raining through the ceiling like gouts of ash, as if a volcano were expunging all the dry contents of the earth." To me, that's beautiful writing. You're welcome.
I love prose that is poetic in nature. Window pane prose is fine, and there have many books written with that sort of style that I love. But it gives me a separate joy when I can love the prose as much as I do the story itself. I just that's not the thing I aspire to. I want to write musical prose if I can.
Well, you said on your Amazon page, I'm not sure where the quote actually comes from, but I think the world is pretty dark and unforgiving place. but a beautiful place too. That's what I want to write about. What do beauty and horror have in common, do you think? Where do they meet?
It's an interesting question. I think in the idea of transcendence, really. I think the kind of horror that I respond to most is the sort of horror in which it's not something necessarily alien to be beaten back, but something that intrudes into the world, or you discover already in the world or in yourself, and it kind of transforms who you are. I think that process can be beautiful. Yeah, and I think that kind of ties back to my own feeling about horror or the supernatural, and it's like I don't have a viscerally negative reaction to the idea of it. Especially when you're talking about. I mean, it's different when you're talking about very real world horrors. That's different. But when you're talking about something on the kind of on the dream level like this, then it's I don't know. I have always found it aesthetically beautiful, and I can't really disassociate them in my mind.
Well, I was thinking about how I would answer that, what I would think that they have in common, what beauty and horror have in common. The best I could come up with is a wonder at the unknown, that both of them show us something we don't think we've seen, but it resonates in us. There's something familiar and unfamiliar at the same time.
Yes, I think that's very true.
What's the first time you remember being scared? Do you have a first memory of something that really sort of that really scared you?
Do you mean through like a story or something, or do you mean just in general?
A story or the real world, if there's whichever is the sort of most potent memory for you.
That's an interesting question. The first time I think I remember, I'm sure there were times before this, but the one that I remember was a dream that I had. That was and nothing's more boring than hearing about someone's dream, but I'll keep it quite short. This was back when I was very small, and I was watching this television show called The Land of the Lost, and there were these little lizard men called sleeve stacks.
Yes. And
I had this dream where I was in this empty house in this field, and one of those things was chasing me around, and it wasn't cheesy like it was in the show, but it was, it had all the visceral reality that I imagined it had for me watching it as a kid, and I was trying to hide from it, and I heard my father's like disembodied laughter, coming down from somewhere. And it creeped me out in a very kind of a profound way, that I still remember vividly to this very day. And it's weird, but that's that earliest memory I have.
Well, was that something you wanted to feel again? Was there sort of a thrill to that?
I don't know if it was a thrill in the sense that I want to re-experience it, but it was interesting in that it was so disorienting and so moving in an interesting way. It was the fact that I can't let go of it, and and weird because Dad in my life was like very kind and supportive and was never the sort of person who would who would laugh as I ran in fear. But so I don't know where that comes from. But it was moving, and I think that's what interests me.
That's probably what made it effective. It was something that you never thought would harm you. That vulnerability and weakness.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, as I think fear comes from weakness in some way, or vulnerability, and discovering that we're weak or vulnerable in a place we didn't think we were.
Yeah, and that's interesting as a general, is a kind of a theme in horror fiction, but perhaps in all fiction. It's it's the how best to say this. It's the well, I guess it's just exactly what you said. It's finding danger in places you thought were safe. And in my own point of view, that's more interesting when it's internal. When we walk around in our lives and we think of ourselves, I imagine mostly as decent, right-thinking people, no matter where we are in various spectra. But if we're honest with ourselves, there are some dark places inside of us, and it's when we discover them or we're forced to reckon with them, I think that the things get interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a couple of characters in these stories who have an interesting kind of hubris to them. Tobias, in the first story,
Mm-hmm.
the Atlas of Hell, he's sort of undone by his desire to help demons who have, well, not demons, they're humans who have been sent to hell and have come back as messengers, and he's tries to put them back into society. He actually tries to find one of them a job working at at a mill or a fast food place.
The fry pit, yeah.
The fry cook.
Run the fryer, so
yeah, and Captain Toussaint in the final story in the butcher's table also has that impulse that he wants to save demons from hell and put them back on Earth so that they can re-enter sort of normal society, and that's an impulse that undoes the both Tobias and Captain Toussaint in the end.
Yeah. That's I think it's I think whether consciously or unconsciously, it's something that happens to a lot of my characters. I think definitely Will, the protagonist of The Visible Filth, comes to recognize his own sort of like a fundamental emptiness, and that leads him to a bad place. I just think it's an interesting topic. I think it's something that it interests me because we're so disinclined to think of ourselves that way. We were, as readers, it's easier and more fun maybe to write about or to read about things that make us feel better about ourselves or reaffirm our own biases or beliefs, and that's just less interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I think I've said, somewhere else, I think horror fiction is at its best when it works in a kind of antagonistic capacity. It's a fiction of antagonism, the literature of antagonism. It's supposed to, I think, challenge you and make you re-examine yourself and how you view the world. Maybe that's supposed to, but it's one of the things that it can do, and I like it when it does.
Going back to that first story of Atlas of Hell, is Jack kind of a stand-in for you as a writer? I mean, he's a bookstore owner, and he's the smart guy trying to resist violence and stay in control of the bullies and the muscle heads.
Not specifically. I think it's funny because I want to write more about this character, and this character is fundamentally a coward, and his actions at the end are motivated purely by self-interest, by a desire to get out of there, no matter who has to go down in order for him to escape. And I certainly, I certainly have. Let's see. I don't think of myself as some heroic type. So there may be some overlap there, but I really don't think of any of the characters that I write as like stand-ins at all. Though that being said, there's something to be in all of them.
Will, I especially found cowardly. He wants to do the right thing, but doesn't often have the courage in the moment to do it. He stays with his girlfriend Carrie when he's really sort of pining after his Alicia, one of the women who comes to the bar. And every moment that he has to show a little backbone and maybe fix things, including that first fight at his bar that sets everything off, he hesitates.
I think that's an accurate. Assessment of his character. He's all about taking the easy way in life, and I think cowardice is a part of that kind of moral cowardice, and he feels entitled. He feels entitled to good things, and that undoes him.
Yeah, that's something that I think will probably resonate with people. I found reading his character, every time he has one of those failings, there's some little thing in the pit of your stomach that reminds you of one of your own failings and makes you question, oh man, what points in my life have I done this? Where have I not shown the backbone where I could have saved myself and everybody else so much trouble if I had just said the right thing in that moment?
Yeah, good. That's what I hope for, because I think we all have that. I think in the age of social media, we're all so conscious of how we present ourselves, and I think self-presentation has become sort of the new. I think we're so invested in the way we present ourselves to the world, and I think that's always been the case. But I think it's been kind of like made much more so with social media, and we sort of, I think we are vulnerable as people to kind of to losing ourselves in that presentation, to buying into our own bullshit, really, and so I think it's important to focus on these kinds of focus on our weaknesses, to remind ourselves that we have them, and to remember them, and to figure out what they mean about us and how we interact with people.
To examine ourselves truthfully, I would think, and that I think that's what makes social media probably such an inviting premise or topic for a story, and especially for horror, because if you're looking at this deep dark thing that you're trying to hide, social media is a very upfront sort of example of people presenting themselves the way they wish they were rather than the way they are, and not having to face that.
Yes, and becoming so invested in that presentation, and as we've seen, to disastrous effect, it's getting very, very harder. It's getting very difficult to agree on a kind of consensus truth. There doesn't seem to be one anymore, and that's doing great damage to our society.
Skull Pocket might be my favorite story in here, maybe just because of the visuals, where you've got these ghouls in this mansion, and the town has a certain idea of who they are, and this incident at the Coldwater Fair in what was it, 1914 or something? I can't remember the exact date.
That sounds about right.
Yeah,
a while ago anyway.
Yeah, where the town has this myth that's developed about these ghouls, and okay, yes, truthfully, they do feed on corpses, and maybe that's not the most pleasant thing, but it also means that they've told the story about what happened at this fair in 2014 that wasn't the truth. And what's the I'm forgetting the lead ghoul's name. Wormcake. That's right. Yeah, he's about to die and wants to finally come clean about what happened and destroy this myth. So, even in that case, you're examining the myths that people create around things, even when the truth is ugly enough, the myths that they create to extrapolate on that.
Yeah, and in that story, by telling the truth, he's also betraying his own religion.
Yes.
It's acknowledging his own regret is something that is just not done. I'm glad you like that story. That tends to be one that people love or hate just because it's just so out there. And that was one of the ones I was worried that I was just going way too far. Like, people are not going to take any of this seriously. But it's one of my favorites. And the idea of a mythology being built around an event or a person, and everyone believing in it so much that it alters the whole world around them was fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. And that story is named after the game of Skull Pocket, which I'll read a quick sentence from that. The game is basically you kick a skull around until it breaks, and the person who breaks it has to eat the brain inside. And the quote from the story is, "The brain, which everyone knows is the worst bit, It's full of all the gummy old sorrows and regrets gathered in life, and the older the brain is, the nastier it tastes. That was another beautiful quote for me. It's such a visceral thing, and there's a vulgarity in it and a humor in it. I think if you don't see the humor in it, you won't appreciate the vulgarity in it.
And that's also with the story structure. That's also a line of dialogue as this person is telling this story to a bunch of kids, which is how the story originally came to me. The genesis of the story was going to be all delivered like that. It was going to be a kid's story told to ghouls. So it was going to be something terrible for us to read, but for ghoul children it would be something fun and joyous. It ended up being something a little bit different, but that was the original idea.
Well, the person telling the story, it's Uncle, what's his name? Uncle
Bigby.
Uncle Bigby, who was formerly known as Floating Brain in a Jar number 17. Was that, I'm sorry, I should have written all these names down before.
That's pretty much it. Brain in the Jar 17. He's part of what's called the Frozen Parliament. Early, like decades ago, when they go into this abandoned house, they find in the attic a whole line of these severed heads floating in jars, and he's just one of them. There's a bigger sort of, for lack of a better word, mythology behind all of this, which I look forward to fleshing out in the future.
Oh, great! Yeah, that's one of the things that I liked about this. There are so many. There are so many sort of unanswered questions. You throw out things like the frozen parliament, and then you don't fully explain what that is. And I kind of like the idea in the story that your mind is drifting out to, well, wait, what was that? What was the frozen parliament? No time to deal with that now. I got to get back to the children.
Right. Yeah, that's something I love in sort of like in fantastical fiction. I like getting the feeling that there is a whole lot more to the world than you're seeing, and these little hints of other things they're just so much fun for me as a reader, and it was fun to be able to do that, writing as well.
You seem to enjoy your secret societies and cults and things. You talk about in the Butcher's Table, especially. There's the buried church. That seems to be a thread through a few of these stories. There are cults and secret societies that get name checked and not fully explained. Is that something that sort of interests you? The secret societies and cults and things of that nature.
Yeah, in the sense that, well, that was very intentional. This book was written as a kind of swing of the pendulum away from my first book. North American Lake Monsters was very kind of grounded in reality for most of it, and the fantastical elements were kind of regulated to the side. It was about how brushes against those elements kind of changed the people's lives. And for the second one, I just wanted to do something different. I wanted to play with tropes of pulp fiction and pulp horror in a way that I didn't allow myself to with the first book. And so, the Satanists, secret societies, brains in jars, underground, cities full of ghouls, all the kind of, for lack of a better word, goofy stuff that I steered away from before. I wanted to say, all right, now I'm going to play with these stories and have fun, but still try to tell serious stories just using these tools. And it was a good time. I'm glad I did it.
How do you balance that? How do you make sure that the more fantastical things don't? How are they grounded in? How do you make sure they're grounded in a reality that the reader can still feel?
Through the characters, always through the characters. The characters, no matter how silly their circumstances, or how over the top or outlandish, always treat them like three-dimensional human beings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Wormcake is a silly name, and he's in a it's a kind of outlandish concept, but it was important to me to treat him at all times like a real person, reckoning with his own demise and reckoning with the sort of the world that he made and the effects that had on other people.
Mm-hmm.
With the Butcher's Table, it's a rival satanic cults, it's pirates, it's travel to another world. It's all just sort of, kind of goofy stuff. But the characters all had to be real. You know, they had to have real thoughts and real emotions, and react with emotional truth to their predicaments.
Mm-hmm.
This is something I think it's one of the lessons I think that I took to heart from reading Stephen King so much growing up. I think particularly the story The Raft. It's an EC horror comic type story.
Mm-hmm.
These kids swim out to this raft and there's this big blob and it eats them. That's about it.
Right.
But King always treats his people like real fully developed people. And so I think when you do that, you can take these crazy situations and still make them, give them some weight, make them resonate with people.
Well, you're giving the readers a viable proxy to step into.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the intent, anyway.
You did quote Hellboy in the very beginning of this, saying, "Now you are standing at the very crossroads of your life, and all your roads lead to strange places," which I don't know if that sort of got into my mind subliminally, but I viewed all of these stories through a Guillermo del Toro and Mike Mignola sort of lens after that. That helped to sort of orient me to these stories, seeing them sort of, picturing them in that sort of style of art, either in the movies or or Mignola's art.
That's good. Yeah, that was kind of the intent. I've been a reader of Mignola's work for as long as he's been doing it, and it kind of for a long time between having finished North America Lake Monsters and starting the work in this book, I was well into it. I was really torn by whether or not I should do this, whether it was a smart choice as a writer trying to build a sort of career. And it was a very sort of cynical way, I guess, of thinking, and I couldn't stop myself from considering whether or not this was going to be something that alienated whatever readership I might have gained with the other book. And will people follow me down this particular path? I don't know. And it was something that bothered me for a while. And I was reading one of Mike Mignola's Hellboy comics that it kind of made me see what a restrictive way of thinking that was. I mean, here was this guy who has spent his life, writing about everything he loved. He threw everything in there. It's got the Hammer horror. It's got girls with Nazi heads. It's got folklore from around the world. It's alternately silly and beautiful and poignant and ridiculous. It's all there, and it all works. And it was a kind of an epiphany. It was a light bulb moment. It was like, I want to be able to do this, and there's no reason that I can't. If I love it, I'm going to throw it in there, and we'll just see what happens. Including that epigraph in the book was kind of like acknowledging that moment, and a writer and artist who I hold in extremely high regard, and also a kind of a lamp, that works the way you described, where it sort of like tells you beforehand the tone to which the book is going to be taking on.
Well, there's this idea that, yes, as an artist, you want to have sort of a wide appeal, and there's a consideration of, yes, I'd like to do this for a living, so I kind of need to make some money at it, so I need to have that broad appeal. But on the other hand, the people that you want to appeal to are the people who can hold these ideas of the silly and the goofy and the outlandish in their heads at the same time as the serious or more weighty things that you're trying to put into the work. You want people who can appreciate that dialectic.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I think besides that, I think the first way of thinking, the one that I was kind of like almost pulled into, is a very restrictive and ultimately I don't know. It's a way of thinking that is going to get you diminishing returns, because then instead of thinking about, I'm just going to write the story that I want to write, which is how I wrote the first book, then you start thinking, well, I better write the story that I think they want to read, and that's a dangerous way to think as a writer. Then you're trying to anticipate. It's also condescending. It's condescending to your audience. It's condescending to your readers, and I think readers pick up on that kind of thing really quickly. And it's a thing I don't ever want to do.
Did you write all of these with the intent or idea that they would wind up in the same book? Because there are some repeated ideas. I searched, the word hollow comes up 22 times, and I think it's in every story in some way, shape, or form. And then there's the more direct sort of threads and themes. The last story, The Butcher's Table, ends up sort of explaining some of the things from the first story, The Atlas of Hell. Were these stories always meant to be in a collection together, or did you write them individually and sort of put that together later?
More the latter. More I wrote them individually. I mean, I knew, of course, that they would be the stories that made up the next book, but I didn't think that they were going to be as integrated as they ended up being. In fact, I was worried for the first few stories that it was going to be a wildly, ununified book. But it ended up being, just the opposite. It was, as far as hollow goes, that's the subconscious thing. That was the hollowness was a thought that I had for writing The Visible Filth. I didn't think much about it with the other stories, and yeah, I'm a big believer in letting the subconscious do its work, and I think it did in that case. With the others, though, there was very little intent to hook them together explicitly, except with The Butcher's Table. That was the last one. Well, I was writing that one the whole time. I would write some and then leave it alone for a long time, then come back to it. It took forever to write, but that was the last one finished. And by that point, I knew that I wanted to explicitly wrap it around with Atlas of Hell, and that was the only one that was intended to be that way, explicitly from the beginning.
Well, it does feel as though it takes place in the same universe. The creatures in the maw that move into this city and sew all of these skins together to make this strange. We're never exactly sure what it is that they're making with these. They do seem to have something in common with the angels in The Visible Filth that find hosts so that they can be born, and the carrion angels in The Butcher's Table. They all seem to be some variation of the same species.
Yeah, and that once I realized that was happening, like when I was writing them off, and I realized they were like echoes, and one of the Black Iron Monks make an appearance there, and that was a consciously placed echo. The other ones were just kind of organic with the story, but I didn't mind. Once I recognized those things, I just decided, okay, well, I'm clearly, I'm not going to fight against that. I'm going to lean into it, and it'll work how it works. Mm-hmm. So I don't think of it as a kind of a unified setting in any real way. I think that Atlas of Hell and Butcher's Table explicitly share a setting. I think it's true there. But the rest, I think they all sort of orbit a kind of similar idea of hell. And so whatever echoes the stories share is more thematic than it is meant to be taken as a kind of rigid set of rules or laws, if that makes any sense.
Well, it functions the same way as mentioning something like the Frozen Parliament. You get the idea that there's more here than is on the surface, and then the reader gets to bring their own interpretation to it. I think what's the art? I think it's a Chinese art of fixing broken vases and things with by putting gold in the cracks.
Yes, and a broken thing becomes beautiful. I
Yeah.
can't remember what it's called offhand, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's the idea at work here, in the collection, and the readers bring their own sort of adhesive to it to put everything together.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. I think that feels exactly right.
Now, when you're describing something fantastical, like in the butcher's table, there's the giant corpse of an angel on the shores of hell, and then there's the kites of human skin in the maw. That I keep coming back to that image. It's such a striking image. Do you draw mainly from your imagination for that, or is there some real world precedent that you think of to extrapolate and sort of build this fantastical image from?
It's pretty much just from my imagination, and I worry sometimes because sometimes I think I should be drawing from a more rigid structure. Like I'm using, there's angels, there's Satan, they call him Morningstar, so I'm like, well, this is obviously drawing from, Christian theology. So I should really, my thought for a while was I should really, learn more about it so I can represent it more accurately.
Mm-hmm.
But I decided not to do that. I decided to go the other way and use some of those points, and then just make up things whole cloth. So most of it is just imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Drawn from all the cauldron full of influences my whole life.
Was there a specific inspiration for the game of Skull Pocket? It's a sort of macabre kick the can variation.
Yeah, no, there wasn't. It was. I knew I wanted it to be a game. The title came before anything else did. Well, the title came along with like the central image was three ghouls standing at the gate, looking at a carnival down a hill and wanting to go join the carnival. And then the title was there, and I didn't know how they related, so the game kind of came to serve that. But it was basically just kick the can.
Mm-hmm. I did want to get back to the idea of inspiration as well, just sort of in a more general sense. I meant to ask this earlier, but we went off in a different direction for a bit. Was there a book or a movie that made you think, this is how I want to make people feel, this is what I want to do? As a writer?
Not a specific thing. I've told the story before. I think the only instance I can think of something like that was when I was in my early 20s. I just sold a short story to the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and it was an okay story. And I read a Hemingway story called A Day's Wait, which is very short and just it hit me like a wrecking ball. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to write things that make people feel powerfully. I want to write things that really hit you. Not the kind of thing that you read and forget.
Mm-hmm.
So I stopped writing for a long time until I felt like I could do something like that. So in that sense, yes. In the sense of genre, it was more a sense of it wasn't a specific work so much as it was discovering kinds of work, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I wanted to write like King because King, when I was a kid, reading him was it was the best thing I could do. It brought me more joy than almost anything else, in my life. And when I started reading Barker in my teens, he took the same tools but did a very different thing with them. He was, he did the sort of transformative horror that I was talking about, horror and beauty and just the shock of transformation and the idea that the monstrous change is not necessarily an unwelcome thing. That like blew the top of my head off.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would point to those writers and as fulfilling the function you described instead of specific works.
Mm-hmm. Do you use things that scare you personally as inspiration for these stories, or do you find when you if you try to write that way, that doesn't necessarily translate as clearly as you would think it would?
No, I do. It never translates as clearly as I want it to. I think that's something that all writers deal with, though. It's like what's in your head is never exactly what you get onto the page. But yeah, I do. More explicitly in the first book than in this one. The idea of, I was, in the first book, the idea of losing your financial stability, of not being able to support people you love was terrifying, and it was terrifying for a lot of people, and remains that way.
Mm-hmm.
There's a story called Ego Where It Takes You. The idea of the child being in danger was just viscerally terrifying to me, and I can, at the time, maybe it was just my imagination, but at the time it seemed like I kept seeing stories about parents who were murdering their kids, and I was just trying to figure out, a way where somebody could get to a place where that made sense, to them, and so yeah, those kinds of stories came very, very overtly from places of my own fear. With the stories and wounds, to a degree, although it's more, I think it's more padded in the fantasy. Like with Skull Pocket, the idea of regretting your life and thinking back on all the choices which you had not made is something that keeps me awake sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Being ethically and morally cowardly is a thing that keeps me awake sometimes. And I think in that sense, yes. Mm-hmm.
And to take a completely different tack, I wanted to ask about your use of smell in some of these stories, which I think adds so much to some of these scenes. Like I can smell the swamp shack where Tobias is keeping the Atlas to hell, and especially Eric's room in the visible filth when Will walks into his apartment and finds he hasn't treated the wounds on his face. He says the place stank of sweat and rotting food, and I think that's an immediate visceral feeling. And you introduced me to the word fug, which I thought was just a band before. The Fugs, which it's such a wonderful. It gives you sort of an immediate feeling because you can smell a place, and I think that puts you there so much more quickly than describing what the walls were like or what the foliage was like.
Yeah, well, good. Fug is a good word.
Yeah,
it almost has a texture to it.
I have been in many places that have a fug to them.
Me too. That's. I'm glad they worked. I'm glad they worked for you. That's just one of the things that we all have to do when we're writing stories is try to make the setting felt or seen. Realize it in a vivid way. And I think I don't usually concentrate on the scent of a thing as much as I should. And I don't remember what I read that reminded me of that, but I think there was something. So it was just something I tried to pay more attention to.
And how much input did you have into the audiobook version of Wounds? I'm glad that I read it first. I really like the audiobook, but I'm glad I read it first because the voices formed a somewhat different impression of the material to me. The narrator for Atlas of Hell sounded to me like Dave Foley. So now when I think of that story, I think of Dave Foley from Kids in the Hall.
Interesting.
As Jack, and I think that would work really well. Actually, I think he's kind of perfect for that. Although I have no idea if the narrator who actually read that looks anything like Dave Foley, but that's the association I have now.
That's interesting. Yeah, I have no idea either. I had very little input. They did ask me to approve their candidates. They sent me like a little recording, little clips of other recordings they had done. And I listened to a couple minutes of each, and I thought, well, this person's, reads well, is articulate. So I approved who they sent me because they all sounded good to me. But I haven't listened to the audiobook. It's the same reason why I don't go back and reread things that I have written unless I have to do it for an edit. I just can't. I reread something I wrote, or I listen to it, and all I can hear are the little infelicities that I think are there that other people might not notice or care about. But I can't listen to my own stuff or read my own stuff after it's done.
Did you have much input into the film version of The Visible Filth? That's on the festival circuit now, right? Or where is that now?
Yeah, it is. And what's going to happen to it in the long run, I'm not sure yet. But I had input in the script version of things. As usual, when I put it into production, I'm not involved in any of that. But Babak Anvari was the writer and director, and he was like open and welcoming of my input the entire time he was writing the script. So I saw it in various drafts, and we talked about various aspects of the story, and that was like a really rewarding and fascinating process.
It must be exciting. Somebody's making a film of your work, but what if you don't like it? That must be nerve-wracking.
It is. Well, I think actually Babak was more worried about whether or not I would like it than I was. I had seen his first movie and thought it was brilliant, Under the Shadow, and with our conversations, I knew that it was important to him to remain true to the core arc of the character. And also, I'm not precious about this kind of stuff. I think I expect it to be different. It's a different medium with different requirements, and I expect people to make the changes that they need to make.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I'm totally comfortable with the idea that this is their work now.
Mm-hmm.
That's Babak's movie. It's not my novella, and he can do what he wants. And I already wrote my novella. It's like it's right now. North American Late Launches is at Hulu, and they're breaking stories for the first season. And I got to be in the writer's room for a couple of those weeks, and it was really fascinating. And they had to change things, and they talked about all the different things they might do, and it didn't bother me a bit. I was excited to be there, and it's theirs now.
Mm-hmm.
My book is out there, but the show for Hulu belongs to them, and I don't expect them to feel any. How to say it? I don't expect them to adhere, note for note, word for word, with the stories I wrote. I think that would be, not only would it not work in a different medium, but it would just be stifling to them as artists. They have their own perspectives.
Well, I would think casting would also be an interesting thing. Armie Hammer, Dakota Johnson, and Zazie Beetz are in The Visible Filth, and I don't know if those are people that you would have pictured in those roles necessarily while you were writing it, because I'm sure you have living, breathing people in your head that no director could ever duplicate for you, because
right.
You've got them all. You've got probably a lot of their details in your head, and a lot of those details that wouldn't necessarily make it to the page.
Sure, yeah, that's absolutely the case. And yeah, I didn't imagine those characters as looking at those actors, but I didn't imagine them. In my head, they were not quite as pretty. They were just like regular folks like me. But again, that's the thing that I didn't really have any. I was excited to have those actors on board, but I didn't really have any. Like, it didn't bother me that they didn't look like who I had in my head. I mean, of course they wouldn't.
Right.
And ultimately, who cares? It's
right.
like sometimes I'm asked about other stories, like, "Well, who do you imagine them casting in this role?" And it's like it's a thing I never think about. It's a thing I don't want to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So when that sort of thing happens, it's always like it's an interesting and pleasant surprise. It's like it's never a thing that I feel invested in.
Mm-hmm. And are you working on anything long form, or do you consider yourself mainly a short story writer?
No, my stories have been getting longer and longer as I write them. And I'm working on a novel now. It's due to the publisher a little bit later this year. So slated to come out in early 2020. Late now, 2021 rather. Yeah, it's another tonal shift from the first two books. This one is on Mars in 1930. So it's more like a kind of a dark fantasy that is, explicitly a horror novel.
And you said this is on Mars in 1930. That's what you said?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that I heard you right. I don't know what more I can ask about that. I'm always sort of hesitant. I always want to know what people are working on, but I know that the impulse is not to say so much because it's not done yet. It's not out there yet. And people don't want to talk it out to other people before they've worked it out on the page.
Yeah, that's the case. It's not something I talk a whole lot about. I just say what the setting is. It's that kind of I don't really know what to say about it because I'm not inclined to talk too much about it, only because, as you say, it's in flux. It's work and draft, and
right,
and kind of like I'm sort of protective of those very fragile ideas.
Right.
They're very fragile before they're finished.
And you don't want it to turn out like all of those other projects set on Mars in 1930.
Yeah, definitely. Are there lots of other ones?
It seemed like it's such a unique premise.
Okay.
I was just making it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. You're probably in that sort of mid-work paranoia where you're like, oh man, is there actually something else like this out there? Did I is this George Harrison, My Sweet Lord, that I've taken somebody else's premise? Are there any new shorts coming out in magazines or journals or anthologies and things that people should look at?
Yeah, there are at least two that are sold that are going to be coming out soon. One is coming out later this year. It's an anthology from Hell&lt called Echoes, and my story is called Jasper Dodd's Handbook of Spirits and Manifestations, ghost story. And there's one I wrote called Scream Queen, but the anthology has not been announced yet, so I really can't say more than that's a story that exists, and it will be coming out in the near future.
And is there anything else you want to mention that's coming out that people should be looking for?
No, that's all. That's all right now. The book is the Wounds is brand new, so hopefully people will pick it up and read it and enjoy it. The movie hopefully will be coming out this year. They're filming the TV series at the end of the summer or beginning of fall. Hopefully that will be on air next year. And the rest is all, we've got a whole bunch of things in draft.
Great. And what's the best place for people to take a look and keep up with what you're doing?
I've got a website, just Ballingrud.com, that, I'm on the usual places like Twitter and Facebook, and that's where things usually manifest first.
Well, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate you doing this. It's a great conversation.
Thanks. I appreciate the invitation. Thanks for having me on.
An arrow to the head isn't always a trick. Thanks again to Nathan Ballingrud for speaking with me for the podcast. You can find out more about his work on nathanballingrud.com and find him on Twitter under nballingrud. And if you enjoy the Department of Tangents podcast, please consider leaving us a review and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Radio Public, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And find posts, photos, and reviews and more about comedy, music, and horror at departmentoftangents.com. Our featured track this week is a cover of the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil from their longtime backup singer Bernard Fowler. This is a spoken word version of the song, as are all the Stones covers on the new album Inside Out. Fowler has been singing with the Stones for more than 3 decades now and had the idea that he could put the lyrics up front by covering the songs in this style. He started doing it at sound checks on tour with the Stones and told Mick Jagger at one point he planned on cutting an album. Jagger apparently gave his blessing, and the album was born. It's out now. Fowler is getting ready for the New Stones tour now, and I caught him before a rehearsal to talk to him about the album and his history with not only the Stones, but with Herbie Hancock, Bootsy Collins, and a host of other musicians. Tune in next week for that. If you want to check out more of his work, you can find it on Spotify and check out his site at bernardfowler.com. Here's a little taste of the album ahead of next week's episode. This is Sympathy for the Devil, as covered by Bernard Fowler.
Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. I've been around for many long years, stole many a man's soul and faith. I was around when Jesus Christ had his moment of doubt and pain. Made damn sure that Pilate washed his hands and sealed his fate. Pleased to meet you. I hope you guess my name. But what's puzzling you is just the nature of my game. I stuck around St. Petersburg when I saw that it was time for a change. Killed the Tsar and his ministers while Anastasia screamed in vain. I rode a tank and held a general's rank when the blitzkrieg raged and the bodies stank. Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name. What's puzzling you is the nature of my game. I watch with glee while your kings and queens fought for 10 decades for the gods they made. I shouted out, who killed the Kennedys? When after all, it was you and me. Let me please introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. And I lay traps for troubadours who get killed before they reached Bombay. Pleased to meet you. Have you guessed my name? But what's puzzling you is the nature of my game. You. Have you guessed my name? But what's confusing you is just the nature of my game. Just as every cop is a criminal and all sinners saints, as heads as tails, just call me Lucifer, 'cause I'm in need of some restraint. So if you meet me, have some courtesy, have some sympathy, and some taste. Use all your well-learned polities, or I'll lay your soul to waste.
Neil Young.